Hello again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the AMA podcast. My name is Matt Ruddick, your host, as always. On today's show, we've got Tyler Dobbs back in the studio, our Government Affairs Director. The show's essentially going to cover some more ground on the FAA's NPRM on remote ID. We are coming down to the wire on the comment deadline. It is March the 2nd. So as this show is coming out, it's just going to be a little over a week. Depending on when you're listening to it, it may be even closer. So if you have not made your comments yet, now's the time to do so. But today we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the NPRM, try to answer some questions that have been coming in and clarify some things. So Tyler, first of all, thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Matt. Glad to be here.
And we also have another special guest I'd love for you to introduce for us.
We do. Today we brought in Jim Williams, and Jim has spent decades working within the FAA, and he is now an advisor for AMA. So a lot of our members think that what they have here at headquarters with the Government Affairs Department, that's what AMA uses in D.C., and it certainly is, but we have a much larger group working behind the scenes. So we have a group of lobbyists and a PR firm and advisors, and Jim is one of those advisors. So yeah, I'd love to introduce Jim Williams, and he can give some background on himself and what he's done in the past and what he currently does for AMA. So thanks for being here, Jim.
Well, hello, and thanks for having me. It's very exciting. I'm I can't say exactly how long time a member. It's been so long I forgot when I signed up, but I am a member of AMA. I've been doing playing around with model aircraft and model rockets since I was about a 10-year-old kid, and I'm about to be 60. So I guess I've been in the hobby for 50 years on and off. My significance to this effort is that when I was back in 2012, right after the last FAA, the next to last FAA reauthorization, I came on board and took on the FAA's executive level leadership. I was the first executive leader for all things unmanned aircraft inside the FAA. And one of the first meetings I had was with AMA to talk about the then brand new Section 336 in the FAA reauthorization and why that was, and I started looking into it, and the folks who were working for me had basically, well, I wouldn't want to say they didn't work well with AMA, and that was one of my objectives when I took over, was to repair that relationship and try to have the FAA and the AMA to work together to foster model aviation safety, and I think we did a good job of that while I was there. I retired in 2015. And became a consultant. And I'm pretty sure that AMA was my very first client after I left the FAA in advising them on how to, interact with the FAA, how to be productive with the FAA, and then if that didn't work, how to get help outside with the FAA. And so it's a wonderful relationship I have with AMA, and I feel like I'm part of the team. And I'm here to represent you to the FAA and put every bit of knowledge I have, as well as the connections I have inside the FAA, to work to help protect our hobby going forward. So glad to be able to do this podcast and help talk a little bit about this remote ID thing that's going on.
Well, Jim, we really thank you for coming on the show. We're really thankful to have you as part of our team, and let's jump right in, guys. So we're coming down to the wire on the comment period. Let's talk about where we are right now. What's the number of comments? I think the latest I saw, we were a little bit over 19,000.
Yeah, we're nearing that 20,000 mark, which is good numbers. I know that we have a lot of our members reach out and say, look, there's 180-some thousand AMA members. There should be 180-some thousand comments in this Federal Register for the proposal. But that's simply, and I think Jim can state that isn't the case. I think the numbers that we're at right now, while we certainly want them to continue growing and we want to bolster those as much as we can, it's great to see so many people that are actively involved in reaching out and taking part in the process. That's what this is about. And 19,000, I'm getting more comfortable with that number. I know we were at the 8,000 or 9,000 mark for quite a while. Our Executive Council took it upon themselves to send out some personal emails to our members starting a couple weeks ago or so, and since then those numbers have really been bolstering, over 1,000 a day, really. Yeah. So
and now,
to see that.
Am I correct in saying, because you're also able to write in by hand comments as well? Would those numbers reflect those entries?
Not on that. A lot of those, I'm not sure, Jim, as they get them in, if they add those, but I think it's possible that, the mail system doesn't work as quickly as what that electronic is. So I know that we have a group of people out there who are looking up names and seeing if people have commented. And while you can certainly check that on the register, that may not take into account some of the written and mailed in. You can even hand deliver your comment if you see fit to do that. So.
I'm sure, that'd be great. So at this point, we're still encouraging people to comment. If you've already commented, comment again. I mean, that's certainly one thing you can do. We've put out some templates to help guide people in shaping their comments. Is there any updates on those that you want to touch on?
Sure. I think we're at 5 or 6 right now. We're actually finalizing one more last template. We think it's important that the FAA hear from the law enforcement community. So we're having a template created for law enforcement. They're welcome. Again, this is just guidance. They can tweak it to how they see fit and what works for them. But we want the FAA to understand if this rule or if this proposed rule works for the law enforcement and what they need to determine where and how people are operating. We have heard from some in law enforcement. There's been some articles that have been pretty public. They feel, certainly what we found, law enforcement feels that it doesn't necessarily meet their needs. So we want the FAA to make sure that they are aware of that.
Yeah. Jim, do you have anything to add as far as where we stand right now on the NPRM?
Well, I think that the number of comments is significant. That is a great indicator of the interest and the energy around a federal rulemaking. I want to reiterate that law enforcement comment. There's been, if you look at it, the customer for this rule, the ultimate customer for this rule is not the FAA. It's not really about aviation safety. It's about aviation security. The reason the FAA is doing this rule is not because it was high on their priority list, but in a couple of years ago, they tried to put out new rules for commercial operations that would allow commercial drone operators to fly over people and to fly at night, which are fairly well understood safety issues. And they were stopped cold because part of the regulatory process inside the federal government is that before any rule gets to go out for comment, it has to be vetted with all of the federal agencies that are interested parties, if you will, to that rulemaking. So the Office of Management and Budget is the office that deals with that, and they send it out and they collect comments. And there was basically a ton of non-concur comments from all the security agencies, people like the Secret Service, the FBI, Homeland Security, Transportation Security Administration, TSA. All of them came back and said, no, FAA, you can't allow flight over people without having some way for us to know if that aircraft is actually legal, legitimate to be operated over those people, or it's a rogue drone that's about to do something nefarious or unsafe. And so that rulemaking was put on hold until this one came out. So this only became a priority for the FAA when they were forced into it by essentially the law enforcement security arm of the federal government. And there, if you read anything about the rule, the whole objective is to provide that knowledge to that police officer in the field to determine, okay, that drone's okay, it's supposed to be there. Oh, that one's not. I got to do something about it. And so they're the customers. And if they don't think it's going to solve their needs, then that's a significant flaw in the rule. And that's why we want to make sure that any of our members who are law enforcement, current or former, or even when they're in the military or in previous careers, whatever, if you read this rule and you think, well, that's not going to help, then please put a comment in that says why you think it's not going to help and what would be needed for it to actually make sense.
Yeah, that's a good talking point to include in your comments that I don't think I've seen a whole lot of people touch on, but it makes a whole lot of sense that this isn't really going to solve that problem.
Right. No, you're exactly right. And one of the things is the information going out is only going to be as good as the information going in.
Yeah.
Like with FAA registration, as you fill out that information, I could have filled that out as Matt Ruddick and have that FAA registration number on there. So that's certainly a loophole within.
Please don't do that.
I won't again.
Let's talk a little bit about something that has been coming up over the last week or so. We've been getting a lot of comments from clubs wanting to comment as a club unit.
We have, which is great. Yeah, we think that's good. We would still recommend that the club individuals send in their personal comments, but certainly if you're a club president or a club official and you want to submit a comment on behalf of your club, that's great. Make sure you put that number in. I'm the president of ABC Club, and I represent 47 members within this club and within the Academy of Model Aeronautics. Those are great. Those are powerful, and it adds a little bit more force behind you. I've heard some rumors that clubs say, well, this proposed rule protects our site. We don't think we need to reach out and comment. We would urge those clubs to reach out and comment. The proposal does have one portion of it that does allow you to request an exemption of your flying site. However, there's not much flexibility within that proposed rule. It essentially gives a CBO like AMA a year to request that site be exempt. Once that year's over, we can't go back and request that site.
Yeah, and if your club has to change sites,
right, then you've lost that after that 12-month period. So there are some protections in place, but they certainly don't go far enough. So we recommend, even if that's your only concern is a fixed flying site, we recommend that you put a comment in and request more flexibility on that site.
Absolutely.
Yeah, especially the part about the being able to make them go on forever. Because one of the things that concerned me is all of the very specific rules about what FAA could use to justify shutting down a flying site. So if that were to happen to you and it's past that 1 year period, you're done. You've got it. You now can only operate with compliant aircraft. So it's don't be short-sighted and say, oh, we're good. We've been at the same site for years. There's always something that could result in you having to move your flying site, and then you're out. You're done. Your extra permission is gone.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing I think that scares me the most, because on the one hand, like if there are some provisions in there that protects our club sites and the flying sites that we have, it's like, okay, at least I see a path to where I can continue enjoying the hobby. But man, when you think about after that 12 months, you're on thin ice, because as soon as your flying site gets taken away for whatever reason, whether it's your fault, whether it's just a matter of circumstance, no matter what it is, you're out in the cold.
Sure.
And that's a terrifying thing to think about.
It is.
And it could be something that's completely beyond your control.
Absolutely.
Somebody builds a subdivision right next to it and makes a noise complaint issue, and you're forced to move, or the heliport is installed, or there's all kinds of things that could happen to make your site untenable in the future. You just can't forecast.
So yeah, to get back to your question, we think that's great. If clubs and club officials want to comment as the club, that's excellent. We would encourage that. Again, we would ask that you also comment individually, but certainly encourage those group comments as well. And we encourage all clubs, whether you think this is going to work for you or not. It certainly doesn't work for the entire community, so we want to make those comments heard. As we need to mention, not all of our members fly at fixed flying sites. So even if it doesn't personally affect you and you think you're going to be covered under the current proposal, we would encourage you to make those comments for the rest of the community.
Absolutely. Let's switch gears a little bit. And, there's a lot of confusion, uncertainty, I guess, from a lot of folks that don't necessarily know how this NPRM process works.
Sure.
And rightfully so. Most people don't sit and read about these things, don't have experience in being involved in them. What are some of the things that you've been hearing that you can kind of clear up as far as what this process looks like and moving forward as this comment deadline approaches, how we can expect to see things play out?
So one thing I think that needs clarified is this is only a proposed rule right now. This is not currently in effect. It's not going in effect next week. It's a proposed rule that we have until March 2nd to comment on. So I think that's important. The things that are outlined in this proposal are not currently available. There's no process right now to request that your flying site be exempt. We've been getting that a lot. I'm with Club so-and-so, we need to request our flying site be exempt through this process. That doesn't exist right now. And we may not know for some time if that makes it into the final rule. We certainly want an exemption process, but we need to see what a final rule looks like before we could even move forward with that. And that won't likely be immediate. I mean, there are possibilities the FAA could push through an emergency rule or get pressure from security agencies and push through an emergency rule. But it's probably more probable, and I'll let Jim speak to this, but that we're going to have quite a long time before we hear anything else. This comment period is going to close on March 2nd. And there'll likely be months. I went to some congressional hearings or meetings a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of the offices were saying, it may be 18, 24 months before we hear anything on the proposed rule. So, Jim, I'll let you fill in a little bit on that. I think it's important. What we don't want is there to be weeks and months from our members wondering what's going on once this comment period closes. So, starting March 3rd, what should our members expect?
So it would probably take me about a half an hour, and everybody would be asleep by the time I was done to explain in detail the regulatory process. It is just let it rest that it's arcane and difficult to understand. Even somebody who has actually been through the rulemaking process on multiple times as part of the FAA, going through, putting out a notice, resolving comments, putting it through. But let it be said that there are a lot of steps required to get the rule out, a lot more steps required to get it, those comments resolved and accepted, and then a lot of coordination that's done to get it out as a final rule. There's a law in place, a federal law in place that governs this whole process. It's called the Administrative Procedures Act, and it is long and complicated what is in that law. One of the key aspects of the law is that it has to go out for public comment, and the agencies have to address all the comments. Now, what that practically means is that they put them in buckets and they address them. So if 1,000 people say that flying sites should be permanent, then that's one comment resolution. That they'll note that 1,000 people said this, so it's really important. But nonetheless, they only have to resolve that comment once. So understand that. If we all were just to send in form letters that all said the same thing, it would amount to one comment that said the same thing, and then we get one resolution. So it's important for people to put in their own comments about their own impact so that the FAA really can see the breadth of this. Now, that said, think about it. Right now there's 18, 19, 20,000 comments. If those were all unique, then that means that somebody has got to write a resolution for 20,000 different comments. And you can imagine how long that's going to take. And the people who do rulemaking inside the FAA, it's not their primary job. It's one of their jobs. For something as important as this, it'd probably be their highest priority. But they're not just sitting around waiting for this rule to come in and then they're all going to get started. So it will take time to go through the comments, figure out what they all say, then come up with comment resolutions. This is all the FAA is doing. Then once the working level folks have come up with proposed resolutions, they'll pitch it to the FAA management. The FAA management disagrees. They got to go back and redo it. Then once the FAA management is happy, then it goes to the Department of Transportation. They go through the same process. They'll look at the resolutions of the comments. If they like it, good. If not, then the FAA's got to redo it. They go back and forth. It's done. Then it goes to the Office of Management and Budget. They do the same thing. So it could go back and forth there. Then once they're happy, then it goes out to the rest of the federal agencies. They make comments on the final rule proposal. They all send their comments in. That could result in a further revision. You see my point. This could go on for quite some time. And the FAA can't talk about it. during this process, during the deliberative process, that Administrative Procedures Act prevents the FAA from having any conversations about the rule unless it's in a public forum, unless it's available to everybody. So if we went in and said, hey, FAA, we talk to you about resolution or comments, they'd say, nope, sorry, we can't do that because the law prohibits it. So we could literally be a year, 18 months, 2 years, whatever it takes for them to get through this very lengthy and complicated bureaucratic process before we hear anything. And then it'll be when the final rule comes out, unless they decide, which could happen, that the changes were so comprehensive in order to resolve the comments that it now represents a significant change to the rule. So they have to go back out for a supplemental comment period and start the process over again. So you see what I mean about the process being long and arcane. It's painful when you're doing it internally, and it's painful on the outside when you're waiting for something to happen. I don't know if that really addressed all your questions or not.
No, it definitely did. My follow-up to that to you is, the second scenario you mentioned there about if they see that the changes would be so drastic they have to go back and have a supplemental comment period. I mean, in your mind, how is that a likely scenario in your mind or not?
No, they'll do everything they can to avoid that because it's just, it just doubles the amount of time and energy that goes into the rulemaking. So that's why it's likely that they wouldn't have to go back out if they delete things. They only have to go back out if they add something new. So, what we can hope is that, so like a minor change. So if they decided that to remove the provisions that make the flying areas exempt, if they remove the provision that essentially tries to sunset those so that they become a permanent part of the solution, then that level of change wouldn't require it to go back out for comment again.
So, and as we talk about change, we hear a lot, we get a lot of questions from our members or statements, I guess, saying, don't even worry about commenting on this. None of this is going to change. The proposed rule's going to be passed as is. That's not always the case, though, Jim. There's a lot of examples where people took part in this process. They put their comments in. The FAA read it and thought, you know what, we didn't think about that. We're going to make that change. Do you have any examples of that in the past, Jim?
Yeah, and the FAA signaled that in this regulation because I think there's 9 places in the preamble where they talk about the FAA is seeking comment on this. And what they're doing is they're telegraphing the fact that we're not sure this is the right answer, what's in the rule. We want you to tell us if you think it is, or if there's a better way to do it, please tell us. So they're definitely open for changes in those specific areas. For example, in the Part 107 regulation for commercial drone operations, the original rule was 400 feet above the ground. So a lot of comments came in and says, well, wait a minute, if I need to inspect a 400-foot and one tall tower, I can't get to the top of it. And besides FAA, your rules say that you're not allowed to operate within 500 feet of the top of that tower for safety reasons. So why shouldn't I be able to operate within 400 feet of the top of the tower because your rules prohibit manned aircraft from being there anyway? And so the rule was changed to actually to reflect that mistake, if you will, in the original. Another area is that when they originally put it out, there were no provisions for waivers. So any deviation from the regulation would have required an exemption, which is like a 6-month process. But there were certain areas that they knew that technology was going to enable things to change, and they probably ought to be a little more flexible. So there's a whole laundry list of rules in the rules now that can be waived, which is a much more simple, straightforward process than an exemption. That was also added as a result of the comments. So there can, and those are huge changes in the actual implementation of that rulemaking that made the whole system different than it would have been if they hadn't been changed. So comments really, really matter to this process. As Shrek would say, really, really.
Well, so one of the things that I've been asked by a couple of listeners that have written in was with regard to the NPRM as it's written right now, do we have an idea? Now, Grant, I totally concede that we're guessing at this, but do we have any ideas of what we think might stand the best chance of being changed via the comment period, or being defeated, or even some of the things that we think stand the best chance to actually go through.
Sure. So I'll follow up with Jim's comment. He mentioned there was 9 specific areas, I think, where they were looking for additional comments. One of those was within the amateur-built portion of the proposed rule. So those probably have a really good chance of being changed by the comment process, we think. We certainly hope that the fixed site location, we want that to be a permanent solution. Again, that's not the only thing that we're fighting for in this proposed rule. We see issues with a number of issues, and we're obviously going to be commenting as AMA on all of those issues. But that fixed site going away, it's hard to find real estate to operate model aircraft, and we certainly don't want to lose what we currently have. So we want to see a change there. I had some congressional meetings a couple weeks ago and met with the Senate Commerce Committee and the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committees, the subcommittees on aviation, and both of them said, they view that flying sites should be a permanent solution. So we hope that Congress continues to support us in that. I'll be having some additional meetings in the next couple of weeks. We mentioned that the comment period for this is March 2nd. I'm going to keep throwing that date out so people remember March 2nd, comment before then. But our work won't end March 2nd. We will continue. We're going to continue going to D.C., meeting with members of Congress. Thankfully, Congress isn't bound by that March 2nd deadline. They can comment to the FAA on what they would like to see change whenever they want and as many times as they want. So we'll be walking the halls there and hitting all the offices over and over and over again as many times as we can or we have to until we get our message across. I'll throw in the coalition that was formed, the AMA Government Affairs Coalition. That the groups there, I think we're nearing around 50 other companies, which is great. We encourage all manufacturers or anybody within the industry, if you want to join that, to get on board. That really helps us in our fight in D.C., and the congressional offices want to hear from companies and organizations within their state. So that's been really beneficial. But again, there's going to be a lull after this March 2nd comment period. We're not going to hear anything probably for some time, but AMA's work will continue. We'll continue working with Congress and others to try to make the needed changes.
Do you have any sense with the conversations you've had on Capitol Hill? Are we seeing any movement as far as support goes within the Senate, within the House?
We are. We have a lot of offices that support us, which we are going to continue. We're going to continue to have those offices reach out. We're going to look for other supporters. But the number of senators and representatives is growing, which is great. The more support that AMA has and the hobby in general has, obviously the more support that Congress will show us. So get your voices heard. It's likely that we will be reaching out to our members sometime after that March 2nd period to do a congressional campaign where we have people send emails and call their congressional offices. Again, that's not going to be immediately after, but there'll be some time. We will be having our members do that. We want our voice to be heard. We want to get this remote ID rule right, and the way it stands right now, we don't think it is.
Yeah. Jim, do you have any input on that?
There's actually some really good examples of that. So back in I think it was the late 80s, early 90s, the FAA passed a regulation requiring all general aviation aircraft to carry a new kind of transponder that was newer and better and was going to help the FAA run the system better. But from the general aviation flyer standpoint, it was just cost. They were going to have to spend $5,000 to $10,000 to keep their aircraft flying, and they were getting nothing new out of it. And so, but the regulation went through. There's all the comments. The FAA ignored the comments. So the AOPA, which is the AMA for the general aviation community, they went to Congress and they lobbied Congress, and Congress actually passed a law that told the FAA to rescind that rule, and they did. So, and today, still today, you can still fly with the same type of transponders that were legal back before that rule came out. So it is very realistic to believe that if the FAA, doesn't do something to make this less of a burden on the AMA community, that AMA who has as many members as AOPA did back in the day, couldn't get it overturned. So that's why I think comments are so important. If they see thousands and thousands of AMA members commenting on this, and they know those same thousands and thousands of people were going to write their congressman if they're not listened to and not heard, and the rule doesn't change, that they know that they'll just get overturned in Congress anyway. So that's what gives us power through the comment process.
Sure, and we're seeing that. You mentioned, are we gaining support more so than ever at my time at AMA? I've had congressional offices reach out to us here and say, we're hearing from your members. What can our office do? We want to be a part of this. We need to learn more about this. So again, we're headed to DC. We're educating those offices, and we're getting those support. So that's important. Very
good. So, with that being said, again, March 2nd is the deadline. It's next week. It's coming up. What's on the agenda for your team? I know you said you're going to still be spending a lot of time in Washington.
We are.
Is there any specifics that you want to talk about?
We have a lot going on, and Jim can vouch for that. We've had SRM panels, safety risk mitigation panels, to get our clubs above 400 feet. We've just got the next list of clubs that are going to be on deck, I guess. That'll be March 10th and 12th, tentatively, are the next group of clubs that will be trying to get altitudes higher than their current letter of agreement allows. We have a meeting with air traffic within the FAA and a few other groups, Flight Standards and the Integration Office, every Thursday. We know that there are some clubs who don't have a letter of agreement, or that letter of agreement is not at the altitude they want. What we don't want is those clubs to be shut down until they go through this process. So, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we think that it probably makes sense to sign those letters of agreement, get the club up and flying, and then we will get that safety risk mitigation panel scheduled for your club and work on getting you a higher altitude. But in the meantime, we certainly don't want you to be shut down until we do that process. Jim and I, we were both at the national safety risk mitigation panel, which is going to put a policy in place to take care of all of our clubs in all both controlled and uncontrolled flying sites, to get them altitudes higher than the 400 feet or higher than the Lance grids. We are working towards that end goal of getting those altitudes. It's just big government, and it takes time, and so we'll just have to work through the process. Jim just took part in another SRM panel. That was a couple weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, for operations on and near airports, and AMA was the only group there representing the hobbyist community. I know there were other groups invited, but they declined to show up. So we were there. I think the outcome for that is good. I think it at least gives us a path to where we can continue operating on or around airports in controlled airspace. So.
Yeah. Yep. And I think it's significant for our members to understand that AMA was invited in to what is essentially an internal FAA process to make sure that what they come up with will be usable by our membership. And they understand that they have an obligation to us to manage the clubs and to give as much flying space as possible, as safe. And it's really significant, and a credit to Tyler and the government affairs group that we were included in those panels. That's not a usual thing. So it's a good job.
So besides that, those SRM panels, again, we have meetings going on right now for the safety and knowledge tests that are coming up. We're part of the ASTM and the ANSI standards bodies. They've got groups working towards standards for a host of things, aircraft design and remote ID and frequencies and all kinds of things that we're taking part in. So without Jim and people like that supporting us here at AMA, we would not be able to accomplish what we've been able to here lately. But all of these things will be continuing once this remote ID comment period closes. But remote ID is our number one priority, obviously, right now. And once that comment period closes, and even before then, Congress is where our attention will be focused, hitting those offices, gaining support from others in the industry. I know we've mentioned them before, but EAA and AOPA and others in the man community, they are big supporters of what we do. They always have our back. They had our back during those SRM panels. They stood up for the modelers and the hobbyist community, so we certainly appreciate them.
Yeah, well, and I think it's so important to reiterate what you just said. It seems like all of our time has been kind of encompassed with this remote ID, NPRM. All those other things you mentioned haven't stopped.
No.
The flying site issues, all of those things. We're still working on those alongside everything else every single day. I can attest because I can never find this guy because he's always in meetings and talking to somebody and trying to make things happen. So I want to thank both of you guys, Jim and Tyler, both for taking a few minutes out of your incredibly busy schedules to come back on the AMA podcast and help inform our members and all of the hobby community about what's going on.
Happy to be here. And Jim, thank you. I'll echo Matt's comments. I appreciate all your help through this and appreciate you being here today to educate our members.
Well, I'm glad to do it. It's extremely important for us to get the word out. The power of this organization is its membership and their willingness to be active in the process. So
agreed.
The more we can do to encourage that, the better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, guys, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you guys out there for listening to this week's episode of the AMA podcast. If you haven't subscribed to our show, please go do so. We're on all the major podcasting platforms: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify. And of course, you can listen right from your browser at modelaircraft.org/podcast. And we release brand new episodes every single Monday, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions for us, please reach out at podcast@modelaircraft.org. I get every single one of those emails. They come into my inbox, and I answer every single one. So send them my way. I love to get them. And, of course, if you're not already a member of the Academy of Model Aeronautics, please head over to modelaircraft.org and see what the AMA can do for you. We'd love to see you out flying very, very soon. And with that, for everybody here at the AMA, thank you so much for watching and listening. And we hope you'll be back here next week on the AMA podcast.